The piano keys felt sticky beneath Sarah McKenzie's trembling fingers as she played the same melancholy tune she'd been playing for the past 3 years. The saloon reeked of stale whiskey, unwashed bodies, and broken dreams. Her emerald dress, once vibrant, now hung loosely on her diminished frame, its sequins dulled by smoke and sorrow. At 26, Sarah had learned to make herself invisible, to blend into the shadows of Martha Sullivan's establishment like a ghost haunting her own life. The sound of glass shattering made her pause mid-note. Through the haze of cigar smoke, she watched as Big Jim Morrison threw another man against the bar, his massive fist connecting with bone. The crowd cheered, their bloodlust evident in their glassy eyes. Sarah's stomach churned, but she kept playing, knowing that silence would draw unwanted attention. "Play something livelier, girl!" Martha's voice cut through the chaos like a rusty blade. The saloon owner's painted face twisted into what she considered a smile, but Sarah saw only the greed lurking beneath. "These gentlemen want to dance, not mourn." Sarah's fingers found a faster rhythm, though her heart remained heavy. She'd been performing this charade for so long that sometimes she forgot who she really was beneath the makeup and forced smiles. The daughter of a schoolteacher who dreamed of becoming a writer, now reduced to entertaining men who saw her as nothing more than a pretty decoration. The fight escalated near the bar. Big Jim had cornered a young miner, barely out of his teens, accusing him of cheating at cards. Sarah knew the boy was innocent. She'd watched him play with the earnestness of someone who couldn't afford to lose. But innocence meant nothing here. Martha nodded to Jake Morrison, Big Jim's younger brother, who stepped forward with a cruel grin. "Please," the young miner pleaded, his voice cracking. "I've got a family to feed." Jake's response was swift and vicious, his fist connected with the boy's jaw, sending him crashing into a table where Sarah often served drinks. The impact was sickening, and she watched in horror as blood began to pool on the floor. The crowd's cheers grew louder, their appetite for violence insatiable. But it was Martha's reaction that froze Sarah's blood. The woman actually smiled, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction as she watched the beating continue. When the boy tried to crawl away, Martha nodded again, and Jake's boot found its mark. The sound of ribs cracking echoed through the saloon like gunshots. "That's enough entertainment for one evening," Martha announced, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Jake, clean up this mess and someone get Dr. Henderson if the boy's still breathing." Sarah's hands stilled on the keys. She'd witnessed violence before, but never with such casual cruelty. The young miner lay motionless, his breathing shallow and labored. Around him, the patrons had already returned to their drinking and gambling, as if nothing had happened, as if a human life meant nothing at all. That night, after the last customer had stumbled out into the Colorado darkness, Sarah sat alone in her cramped room above the saloon. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, carrying with it the promise of an early winter storm. She stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror, seeing not the woman she'd become, but the frightened girl who'd arrived here 3 years ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of hope. The decision came to her like a lightning strike, sudden and illuminating. She couldn't stay here another day, another hour. The young miner's blood was still on her hands, metaphorically speaking, because she'd done nothing to stop it. She'd sat there and played piano while a boy was beaten nearly to death for Martha's amusement. Thunder rumbled overhead as Sarah gathered her few possessions. A small bag of coins she'd hidden beneath a loose floorboard, her mother's Bible, and a photograph of her parents. The storm was intensifying, but she couldn't wait for better weather. Fear had been her constant companion for too long, and tonight, courage finally won. She slipped out through the back door as the first snowflakes began to fall. The wind cut through her thin coat like knives, but she pressed forward into the darkness, leaving behind the only life she'd known since becoming an orphan. Behind her, the saloon's lights flickered in the distance, and ahead lay nothing but uncertainty and the unforgiving wilderness of the Colorado mountains. Sarah McKenzie was running toward an unknown future, but for the first time in years, she was running toward something instead of away from it. She was running toward the possibility of becoming human again. The storm had transformed the mountain trail into a treacherous maze of ice and shadow. Sarah's thin boots offered little protection against the biting cold as she stumbled through knee-deep snow, her breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air. Each step forward felt like a battle against nature itself, but turning back meant facing Martha's wrath, and that terrified her more than freezing to death in the wilderness. Her legs gave out near a cluster of pine trees, their branches heavy with snow that fell like frozen tears. Sarah collapsed against the rough bark, her body shaking uncontrollably. The thin coat she'd grabbed in her haste provided no real warmth, and she could no longer feel her fingers or toes. Through the swirling snow, she caught glimpses of lights flickering in the distance, but they seemed impossibly far away. "God, if you're listening," she whispered through chattering teeth. "I know I haven't been talking to you much lately, but I could really use some help right now." Her mother's Bible pressed against her chest through the fabric of her coat, a small comfort in the overwhelming darkness. The wind howled like a banshee, drowning out her thoughts and filling her ears with the sound of her own mortality. Sarah closed her eyes, wondering if this was how it would end, frozen to death on a mountain trail, just another casualty of a life lived without choices. But then, cutting through the storm's fury, she heard something that made her heart skip, the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. Forcing herself to stand, Sarah followed the sound like a beacon through the tempest. Her feet were numb, causing her to stumble repeatedly, but she pressed on with the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until she could see the warm glow of a cabin window through the trees. Thomas Henderson paused in his wood chopping when he heard the sound. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakably human, a woman's voice calling out in distress. He'd lived alone in these mountains for 5 years, and visitors were rare, especially during storms like this. Setting down his axe, he grabbed the lantern from his porch and ventured into the swirling snow. "Hello?" he called out, his deep voice carrying over the wind. "Is someone there?" Sarah's legs finally gave out completely when she saw the tall figure approaching with a light. She fell face first into the snow, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion and cold. Through the haze of semi-consciousness, she felt strong arms lifting her, carrying her toward warmth and safety. "Jesus Christ," Tom muttered as he carried the unconscious woman into his cabin. "What the hell were you doing out in this storm?" The warmth hit Sarah like a physical force, and she began to stir as Tom laid her gently on his sofa near the fireplace. She opened her eyes to see a bearded man with kind brown eyes studying her face with concern. His hair was dark brown, streaked with premature gray, and his weathered hands spoke of hard work and honest labor. "Easy there," Tom said softly, his voice gentle despite his imposing size. "You're safe now. Let me get you some dry clothes and something warm to drink." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat felt raw from the cold. She managed only a whisper, "Thank you." Tom disappeared into another room and returned with a thick wool blanket and a steaming cup of coffee. "This should help," he said, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "Drink this slowly. Your body needs time to warm up." As feeling returned to her extremities, Sarah studied her rescuer. He was probably in his mid-30s, with calloused hands and scars that spoke of a life lived outdoors. His cabin was simple but clean, with handmade furniture that showed remarkable craftsmanship. Books lined one wall, and she noticed a Bible among them, well worn from use. "I'm Thomas Henderson," he said, settling into a chair across from her, "but most folks call me Tom." "And you are?" "Sarah," she replied, her voice still weak. "Sarah McKenzie." Tom nodded, not pressing for more information. "Well, Sarah McKenzie, you picked a hell of a night to be wandering around in a blizzard. What were you running from?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sarah looked into his eyes and saw no judgment, only genuine concern. For the first time in years, she felt like someone was actually seeing her as a person, not a commodity. "Everything," she whispered. and Tom understood that some conversations required time and trust. "Well," he said, standing up and adding another log to the fire, "you're welcome to stay until the storm passes. We can talk more when you're feeling stronger." Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. She was still a long way from safety, but for the first time since leaving the saloon, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found something worth running toward. 3 days had passed since the storm, and Sarah found herself settling into an unexpected routine in Tom's cabin. Each morning, she woke to the sound of him chopping wood or tending to his animals, and each evening, they shared simple meals by the fireplace. The silence between them was comfortable, not the tense quiet she'd grown accustomed to at the saloon, but something peaceful and restorative. Tom had given her his bedroom while he slept on the sofa, a gesture of respect that had shocked her. In her world, men took what they wanted without asking, but Tom seemed to operate by different rules entirely. He asked before entering a room, brought her meals without expecting anything in return, and spoke to her as if her thoughts and feelings mattered. "You don't have to keep cooking for me," Sarah said on the 4th morning, watching him prepare breakfast. "I can earn my keep." Tom paused in his stirring of the porridge, a slight smile playing at his lips. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" The question caught her off guard. At the saloon, there had been only one way for a woman to earn her keep, and the thought of it made her stomach turn. I can clean or mend clothes or..." She trailed off, realizing how few practical skills she actually possessed. "Sarah," Tom said gently, setting down his spoon and turning to face her, "you don't need to earn anything. You're my guest, and guests don't pay for hospitality." The word guest hung in the air between them. When had anyone ever treated her as a guest? She'd been a burden, a commodity, a necessity, but never simply a person deserving of kindness without expectation of return. That afternoon, Tom was working on a rocking chair in his workshop, a small building behind the cabin. Sarah watched from the doorway, fascinated by the way his hands moved with such precision and care. The wood seemed to come alive under his touch, transforming from rough planks into something beautiful and functional. "My father was a furniture maker," she said quietly, surprising herself with the admission. Tom looked up from his work, his eyes encouraging her to continue. "He used to let me help him sometimes before..." She stopped, the memories too painful to fully voice. "Before he and my mother died in the cholera outbreak." "I'm sorry," Tom said simply, and she could hear the genuine sympathy in his voice. "How old were you?" 15. Sarah stepped closer to the workbench, running her fingers along the smooth wood. "I remember the smell of the workshop, the sound of his tools. He always said that working with your hands was a form of prayer." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "Your father sounds like a wise man. Would you like to help me with this?" Sarah's eyes widened. "I don't know how." "Neither did I once," Tom replied with a gentle smile. "But I learned, and so can you." For the next hour, Tom patiently showed her how to sand the wood, how to follow the grain, how to feel when the surface was smooth enough. His hands covered hers occasionally, guiding her movements, and Sarah was struck by how different his touch felt from any man's she'd known. There was no possession in it, no demand, just guidance and patience. "You're a natural," Tom said, as she worked on a particularly difficult curve. "Your father would be proud." The compliment hit her like a physical blow, and she had to stop working to catch her breath. When had anyone last said they were proud of her? When had anyone seen potential in her instead of just utility? That evening, as they sat by the fire, Tom asked the question she'd been dreading. "What were you running from, Sarah?" She'd been preparing for this moment, but still found herself unable to speak. How could she explain the saloon, the men, the things she'd been forced to do to survive? How could she tell this good, decent man about the darkness she'd lived in? "I worked at Martha Sullivan's saloon," she said finally, the words feeling like stones in her throat. Tom's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Not judgment, but understanding. "That must have been hard. You don't know what that means, do you?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I know enough, Tom replied quietly. I know that sometimes people do what they have to do to survive. And I know that what you've done doesn't define who you are. Sarah stared at him, searching for any sign of disgust or condemnation, but found only compassion. How can you say that? You don't even know me. I know that you risked freezing to death rather than stay in a place that was destroying you, Tom said, his voice firm but gentle. I know that you've helped me in the workshop with more grace and skill than most men I've known. I know that you read my books when you think I'm not looking, and that you say grace before every meal, even though you think I don't notice. Tears began to fall down Sarah's cheeks, and she wiped them away angrily. You don't understand. I'm not the kind of woman who deserves what? Tom interrupted. Kindness, respect, a chance to start over? Yes, she whispered. Tom leaned forward in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. Everyone deserves those things, everyone, and anyone who told you otherwise was lying. In that moment, something inside Sarah's chest loosened, a knot of shame and self-hatred that had been tightening for years. For the first time since she was 15 years old, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worth saving after all. A week had passed since their conversation by the fire, and Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: contentment. She'd fallen into a rhythm with Tom that felt natural, almost domestic. She cooked while he worked in his shop. They read together in the evenings, and slowly she began to remember who she'd been before the saloon claimed her soul. It was while dusting Tom's bookshelf that she made the discovery that changed everything. Hidden behind a leather-bound volume of Shakespeare, she found a small stack of newspapers from Cedar Falls. Her heart stopped as she saw the headlines: Saloon Girl Goes Missing, Search Continues for Martha Sullivan's Employee, and most damning of all, Reward Offered for Return of Sarah McKenzie. Her hands trembled as she read Martha's quotes to the reporter. Sarah is like a daughter to me. I'm terribly worried about her safety. She's not equipped to survive on her own in these mountains. The lies were so smooth, so convincing, that Sarah almost believed them herself. Find something interesting? Sarah spun around to find Tom standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The newspapers scattered to the floor like fallen leaves, her secret exposed in black and white. You knew, she whispered, her voice hollow with betrayal. You've known who I was this whole time. Tom stepped into the room, his movements careful and deliberate. Yes, I knew. The reward money, Sarah said, backing away from him. That's what this has been about. You've been keeping me here until you could collect. Sarah, no. Tom's voice was firm but gentle. That's not... Don't lie to me. The words exploded from her throat with years of accumulated pain. I should have known. Men like you don't help women like me unless there's something in it for them. Tom's face hardened, but not with anger, with something that looked almost like hurt. Is that really what you think of me? I don't know what to think anymore, Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. I thought maybe I'd found someone who saw me as more than just what, Sarah? Say it. More than just a whore. The word hung between them like a physical barrier, ugly and raw and true. Tom's expression softened, and he took a careful step forward. Sarah, listen to me. I've known who you were since the second day you were here. Jake Morrison came by asking if I'd seen you. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Jake was here? I told him I hadn't seen anyone matching your description, Tom continued. I lied to him, Sarah. I chose to lie for you before I even really knew you. Why? The question was barely audible. Because I saw how terrified you were that first night. Because I watched you say grace over a simple meal like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because when I handed you that wood to sand, you treated it like it was made of gold. Tom's voice grew stronger, more certain. Because in 1 week, you've shown me more genuine kindness and gratitude than most people manage in a lifetime. Sarah stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. But the reward money can rot in hell along with Martha Sullivan, Tom said firmly. I wouldn't take that woman's blood money if I was starving. Then why keep the newspapers? Tom was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I needed to understand what I was up against. Because I needed to know how hard they were looking for you so I could keep you safe. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Keep her safe. When had anyone ever wanted to keep her safe? Tom, you don't understand what you're risking, she said desperately. If Martha finds out you're hiding me, let me worry about Martha Sullivan, Tom replied, his jaw set with determination. The question is, Sarah, what do you want? Do you want to keep running, or do you want to stay and fight for something better? For the first time in her adult life, Sarah had a real choice to make, not between bad and worse, but between the familiar prison of her past and the terrifying freedom of an uncertain future. She looked into Tom's eyes and saw something that took her breath away. He was looking at her like she was worth fighting for. I want to stay, she whispered, and in those 4 words, Sarah McKenzie finally chose herself. 2 weeks after Sarah's decision to stay, their fragile peace was shattered by the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Tom was in his workshop when he heard them, and something in the aggressive rhythm of the hoofbeats made his blood run cold. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, his worst fears confirmed when he saw Martha Sullivan dismounting from her horse, flanked by Jake Morrison and 2 other men he didn't recognize. Sarah, he called softly, not wanting to alarm her but needing her to understand the gravity of the situation. We have company. Sarah appeared in the doorway of the cabin, and the color drained from her face when she saw the riders. Oh God, they found me. Martha Sullivan looked exactly as Sarah had described her, a woman in her 40s with painted features that couldn't hide the hardness in her eyes. She wore an expensive dress that seemed absurdly out of place in the mountain wilderness, and her smile was as cold as the winter wind. Well, well, Martha called out, her voice carrying easily across the clearing. If it isn't little Sarah McKenzie, we've been so worried about you, dear. Tom stepped out of his workshop, rifle in hand, but not yet raised. Ma'am, you're on private property. I'm going to have to ask you to state your business. Jake Morrison spat into the snow, his hand resting casually on his gun. Our business is with the girl, Mountain Man. She belongs to us. Nobody belongs to anybody, Tom replied, his voice deadly calm. Sarah is a guest in my home, and she's free to leave or stay as she chooses. Martha's laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, how romantic. Has she told you what she is, Mr. Henderson? What she's done to earn her keep these past 3 years? I know exactly who Sarah is, Tom said firmly, and I know what kind of woman would force a girl into that life. The insult hit its mark, and Martha's facade slipped for just a moment, revealing the vicious creature beneath. You have no idea what you're dealing with, you simple mountain fool. Sarah owes me money, a considerable debt that needs to be repaid. Sarah stepped forward from the cabin, her voice shaking but determined. I don't owe you anything, Martha. You took everything from me, my dignity, my freedom, my hope. I won't let you take anything else. Brave words from a whore who ran away in the middle of the night, Jake sneered. But you're coming back with us, whether you like it or not. That was as far as he got before Tom's rifle swung toward him. I'd reconsider that statement if I were you. The tension in the clearing became electric. The 2 unknown men Martha had brought shifted nervously, clearly not expecting armed resistance. Jake's hand moved closer to his gun, but Tom's rifle was already trained on him. This is quite touching, Martha said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. But let me make something clear, Mr. Henderson. Sarah is damaged goods, used up and worthless except for the work she does for me. Why would a decent man like yourself want to keep her around? The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each one designed to reopen old wounds. She felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller, as all the progress she'd made over the past weeks threatened to crumble. But then Tom spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. Because she's the strongest, most courageous woman I've ever met. because she chose to walk into a blizzard rather than spend another night being degraded by people like you. Because she's kind and intelligent and deserves so much better than the life you forced on her. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they weren't tears of shame or fear. They were tears of recognition. Someone finally saw her as she truly was. Martha's face twisted with rage. "You'll regret this, Henderson. Both of you will regret this." "The only thing I regret," Tom replied, "is not being there to stop you sooner." Martha remounted her horse with furious efficiency. "This isn't over, Sarah. You can hide behind your mountain man for now, but I'll be back. And when I am, you'll remember exactly what you are and where you belong." As the group rode away, Sarah collapsed to her knees in the snow, the emotional toll of the confrontation finally overwhelming her. Tom was beside her in an instant, his strong arms pulling her against his chest. "It's okay," he whispered into her hair. "She's gone. You're safe." But they both knew Martha Sullivan wasn't the type of woman to give up easily. This was just the beginning of a war Sarah wasn't sure she was strong enough to fight. The confrontation with Martha had awakened something fierce in Sarah. For days after their visit, she and Tom prepared for what they both knew would be Martha's return. But when it came, it wasn't in the form they expected. Instead of violence, Martha chose a more insidious weapon. The truth, twisted and weaponized. She spread word throughout Cedar Falls about Sarah's past, painting Tom as a fool who'd been deceived by a manipulative woman. The story reached the ears of Reverend William Hayes during his weekly visit to town, and something about it troubled him enough that he decided to ride up to Tom's cabin himself. Sarah was hanging laundry when she saw the elderly preacher approaching, and her heart sank. She'd heard enough sermons in her lifetime to know that men of God rarely brought comfort to women like her. "Mrs. McKenzie," Reverend Hayes said, dismounting from his horse with the careful movements of an older man, "I wonder if we might have a word." "If you're here to tell me I'm going to hell, Reverend, you'll have to wait in line," Sarah replied, her defenses rising immediately. The old preacher chuckled, surprising her. "Actually, I'm here because I've been hearing some interesting stories in town, and I've learned to distrust interesting stories. They're usually only half true." Tom emerged from his workshop, tension visible in his shoulders. "Reverend Hayes, what brings you up the mountain?" "Truth-seeking mostly," the preacher replied, "and perhaps a bit of meddling if I'm being honest." Over the next hour, Sarah found herself telling her story to the Reverend, expecting judgment, but finding only compassion. When she finished, Reverend Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. McKenzie," he said finally, "I've been preaching in these mountains for 30 years, and I've learned that God's grace is bigger than any mistake we think we've made. The question isn't what you've done, but what you're going to do now." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "I mean that Cedar Falls could use a woman with your strength. We've got other girls in town who are trapped in situations similar to what you escaped from. They need someone who understands, someone who's been where they are." The idea hit Sarah like lightning. She could help others, could turn her pain into purpose. When Martha returned 3 days later with Jake and a sheriff she'd bribed, she found not just Tom and Sarah waiting, but Reverend Hayes and a dozen townspeople who'd come to hear Sarah's story firsthand. The preacher had been busy, rallying support for the woman who'd chosen courage over comfort. "This woman is a criminal," Martha declared to the sheriff. "She stole from me and fled in the night." "Mrs. Sullivan," Reverend Hayes said calmly, "we've heard Miss McKenzie's account of her time in your establishment. Would you like to address those allegations in front of these witnesses?" For the first time since Sarah had known her, Martha Sullivan looked uncertain. The crowd's mood was clearly not in her favor, and even the sheriff seemed uncomfortable with his position. "Sarah McKenzie is free to make her own choices," the sheriff finally declared. "And if she chooses to stay here, that's her right as an American citizen." Martha's face flushed with rage, but she was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. As she rode away for the final time, she spat one last curse. "You'll regret this, all of you." "No," Sarah called after her, her voice strong and clear. I regret the years I wasted being afraid of you." That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Tom took Sarah's hand in his. "So what happens now?" Sarah looked out over the valley below, where the lights of Cedar Falls twinkled like stars. "Now we build something beautiful," she said. "Together." 6 months later, Sarah McKenzie became Sarah Henderson in a ceremony performed by Reverend Hayes. But more importantly, she'd opened a safe house for women fleeing situations like her own, funded by Tom's furniture business and supported by a community that had learned to see past a person's history to their heart. She'd left the saloon broken and afraid, but she'd entered Tom's cabin and found not just shelter but herself. And in choosing to stay, she'd discovered that sometimes the best way to heal from the past is to help others escape it.